This video will just give you an introduction to the concepts of probability. So what is the idea of probability? I'm sure you use the term yourself, heard it many times. The probability that that will happen is this. The probability that somebody will win a game. The probability that it will rain. What is the idea of that? Well, probability is a science of chance behavior. So things that happen by chance may or may not happen. And the problem is that chance behavior is really unpredictable until you get a large number of trials of whatever it is, and then it has a very regular, very predictable pattern. The example of that is when you flip a coin. It's very unpredictable whether you get heads or tails. But over the long run, if you flipped a coin 1,000 times, it will come really close to being 50-50 on heads and tails. And that's what we mean by chance behavior being unpredictable in the short term, but having a regular and predictable pattern in the long run. And so that's why we use probability to get useful results from samples and experiments, because we have the long run to look at to get that regular predictable pattern. So randomness and probability. Random means that individual outcomes are uncertain, but that there's a regular distribution of outcomes in a large number of repetitions, just like the coin example. The individual outcome of a flip of a coin is uncertain, but you're going to have a pretty regular distribution of outcomes when you flip it a lot of times. And the relative frequency or the proportion of occurrences, it settles down towards one value over time. And that one value is what we call the probability. So again, in our coin example, the probability that you flip heads with a fair coin is 1/2. It happens about half the time. And if you took 1,000, you would be real close to 1/2. And if you took 100,000, you'd probably be a heck of a lot closer. Over time, with many, many repetitions, you settle down to that one value. So you can determine the relative frequency probability by looking at a long series of independent trials. If you didn't know what the probability was of flipping heads, you could just flip a coin over and over and over. But 10 times isn't enough. Okay, it has to be over a long series. So I have many samples. You can do this with simulation. There are a number of different applets that simulate this that are real interesting to look at. And here's just a graph of what happens when you flip a coin with heads and tails. Notice how far apart the gray and the red are when they start. The red represents when you flip the tails, and the gray is flipping heads, so the probability of each. And notice how they converge to 0.5, both of them, after 5,000 trials. It's a little bit hard to read this graph because of the labels, so that's what I'm explaining to you, is that red is either heads or tails, and the gray line is the other one. So the sample space of a random phenomenon is a set of all possible outcomes. For flipping a coin, the sample space is heads or tails. For rolling a die, it's roll a 1, roll a 2, roll a 3, roll a 4, roll a 5, roll a 6. Okay, so the sample space is the verbiage that we use to describe that. And an event is an outcome from that sample space. It's something that happens. I flip a head. I roll a 2 on a die. An event is something that happens. It's an outcome. And a probability model then is a mathematical description of what's happening. We include the sample space and a way of assigning probabilities to events. So a probability model for flipping a coin would have a sample space, HT, heads, tails, and a probability of 1/2 assigned to each of those events. Here is a probability model for rolling 2 dice. Everything that can happen, from you can roll snake eyes, you can roll a 4 and a 3, you can roll 2 6s. You see here, this is every single possible thing that can happen when you roll a pair of fair dice. That's the sample space in that blue box. Each outcome there has the same probability of occurring, 1 out of 36. Put those two pieces of information together and you have your probability model. And there are some rules for probability. And we'll get into these much further. But the first thing you need to know is that a probability has to be a number between 0 and 1. 0 means it doesn't happen at all. 1 means it definitely happens. You can't have something happen less than not at all, or more than all the time. So probability is a number between 0 and 1, inclusive. It could be 0 and it can be 1. And we interpret it as the proportion of times that can be expected to occur. So you need to get used to seeing it represented both by a decimal and by a percentage. Pay real close attention when you're being asked a question, whether you're asked for a percent or whether you're asked for a decimal. And again, if the probability of an event were more than 1, then it would occur more than 100% of the time, which would be impossible. Remember that. A lot of people make a mistake in calculations and get a probability of 7 and think that must be right because our calculator said that was right. You just got to think, is it over 1? It can't be the answer. So that is your brief introduction to probability. In future videos, we will get more in depth into the rules of probability and how to calculate them.